So today, I titled the lecture, I mentioned this last time, Declaring Independence. And as you'll see, I'm going to be talking about a moment, a document, and some really important meanings. Now, obviously, I'll be talking about the Declaration of Independence and its chronological surroundings, which we'll be commemorating next year in 2026, the Declaration's 250th anniversary. But more than that, in today's lecture, I'll be exploring what the Declaration meant in the context of its time. Because to us, the Declaration of Independence is a founding document, all capital letters, right? This is so much in this period, this is how we think of it. But to people at the time, it was one thing among many that had to be done in the Second Continental Congress. Because as I mentioned very briefly on Tuesday, the Second Continental Congress was doing a lot in 1775 and 1776. As John Adams put it in a letter to Abigail Adams, not long after the start of the Second Continental Congress, when 50 or 60 men have a constitution to form for a great empire, and I love the fact that it's a great empire in 1776, when 50 or 60 men have a constitution to form for a great empire, at the same time that they have a country of 1,500 miles extent to fortify, millions to arm and train, he's very ambitious, John Adams, a naval power to begin, an extensive commerce to regulate, numerous tribes of Indians to negotiate with, a standing army of 27,000 men to raise, they don't even have the army yet, pay, victual, and officer, I shall really pity those 50 to 60 men. So this is what he's thinking at the launching of the Second Continental Congress. Big, it's very ambitious, but still, he's making a list of all of the things that need to be thought about as the Second Continental Congress opens. Because even before independence was declared, the Congress had to organize a war effort, had to figure out how to raise money to pay for a war effort, and that was just the start. Now remember, I ended Tuesday's lecture by talking about April of 1775, when British troops fired upon British subjects at Lexington and Concord, which was a stunning event. So in May of 1775, when the Second Continental Congress met, it was clear that they were going to have to think about the need for defensive warfare. One of the documents that I pulled for people to look at this week is a lengthy list, kind of along the lines of what I just read, but in this case, it's really a list that Adams was making towards the start of the Second Continental Congress about what had to be done by the Congress. And I encourage you to go and look at it. It's a long list, but he's saying things like, okay, we have to worry about coinage, and then we have to think about France. Oh, and we also have to think about Spain. It's this long list. And then right at the bottom, I think one item before the bottom, he says, oh, Declaration of Independence. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, we have to declare independence. Now, John Adams was an early and loud proponent of American independence. But in January of 1776, there were a lot of colonists who were not prepared to speak about independence. I mean, again, just think about it, right? Break away from the mother country, break away from the British Empire, maybe even have to fight against the British Empire. It was hard, impossible for some people to fathom that. And that brings us to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And I've assigned it as part of this week's reading. I hope you enjoy it. This is me speaking as a historian, but one of the things I love about actually this class generally is that we're all, for the most part, I think except for one exception, all the readings are primary documents from this time period. So you're in this class immersing yourself in the period that we're talking about. And in the case of Common Sense, like this is the history, right? You are reading the pamphlet that Americans were reading in 1776 that was really influencing their thoughts and actions. So it's kind of a you are there moment when you really can absorb some of what that moment meant to people at the time. Now, why was Common Sense important in the context of its time? in part because it discussed American independence in a radically simple style, aimed at being accessible to a broad audience. And it argued for independence in 3 steps. First, it refuted prevailing ideas against independence. Second, it went one step further and demonstrated the necessity of independence in the colonies and how possible it was. And third, it demonstrated what was to Paine the stupidity and utter uselessness of not only the British monarchy, but all monarchies. Now, that was a really radical message for its time. All the more radical given that American independence really hadn't been seriously discussed in the public sphere by the great majority of colonists, with the exception of more radical thinkers. So for many, reading Common Sense and seeing that kind of a bold, in-your-face, plainly stated common sense statement, it was kind of a conversion experience. And there were fence sitters at the time who were kind of radicalized by it. It was being talked of everywhere. As Benjamin Rush explained, my graduate mentor called Benjamin Rush Doctor to the Stars because he was a doctor who treated lots of founders. And he, as the introduction to Common Sense shows, he was talking to Paine when Paine was thinking of writing Common Sense. So as Rush explained at the time, the effects of Common Sense, quote, were sudden and extensive upon the American mind. It was read by public men, it was repeated in clubs, it was spouted in schools, and in one instance delivered from the pulpit instead of a sermon by a clergyman in Connecticut. Now you have to know I went looking to see if I could figure out what the clergyman, which one it was and what pulpit it was, because I am at a pulpit. Sadly, it was not this pulpit. I could not figure it out, but I can say that it was not here. But still, Rush is giving you a sense of the impact of Common Sense. Its rhetoric was so powerful that it inspired many to stand back and really examine their situation and what they thought about their place in the British Empire for the first time. In the end, regardless of whether one agreed with Paine's argument or not, his pamphlet did 3 fundamental important things. Number 1, it focused the prevailing colonial political conversation on independence. Number 2, it lifted that argument. It lifted consideration of independence above constitutional reckoning and made it something, it rooted it in a way that it was something really to be talked about beyond abstract terms. And it inspired a lot of other people to write about independence as well, some of them for it, some of them against it. But in all of these ways, it had a huge impact. As one reader in Boston noted, independence a year ago could not have been publicly mentioned with impunity, and now nothing else is talked of. Now, a word of caution here. They're coming to get us for declaring independence. Now, a word of caution here. It may be tempting, given everything that I'm saying, I'm waxing enthusiastic, to say that common sense led to American independence. Now, certainly Thomas Paine, who had more than a healthy-sized ego, would have liked to say that. He talked about how important common sense was all the time. I think at one point he says something like, it's the most important piece of writing in all of history. It's like, okay, well, it was important. And maybe he did say that it led to declaring independence. You cannot make that absolute direct connection between common sense and independence, but you can say that the pamphlet was so clear and so powerful that it shattered some psychological resistance to the idea of independence. It brought it out into the open, and it made it something that could be talked about. Also, on a more social level, common sense invited an entire range of people into a political conversation that they hadn't necessarily been deeply engaged in before. As one contemporary of Paine's wrote, Paine spoke a language which the colonists had felt but not thought. Paine himself said that his quote-unquote design was to make those that can scarcely read understand So he avoided, as he put it, every literary ornament, and he put it in language as plain as the alphabet. He intended to write, as he put it, simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. So in that way, common sense was popular culture, but it wasn't low culture. It was intended to reach a mass popular audience. Now, I cannot resist quoting what Thomas Jefferson said about common sense for a very good reason, which you'll hear momentarily as I offer his sentiments. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "No writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, in perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple and unassuming language, thereby doing nothing that he was praising Paine for doing." There's nothing simple and straightforward about perspicuity of expression. Okay, so now we are here in 1776. And in a way, we're going to move from one document, common sense, to another, the Declaration of Independence, and an iconic one at that. And I will say, I should have mentioned the slide. Normally when I teach, I do not use slides. I just like, it should be obvious by now, I like to use stories to get across the humanness of history. So now I have the extra bonus of slides. So last class, I had that cartoon of actually King George being thrown from his horse, which is very obviously connected to what we're talking about. This is Thomas Jefferson's rough draft of the Declaration. And I'm putting it here because look at the cross-outs and the add-ins. How many of you, I'll bet a lot of you did. When I was growing up, I had like the sort of fake yellow Declaration with the fancy font on my bulletin board, like, the Declaration. It did not look like that. And so that, to me, is just a wonderful representation of the fact that it was people trying to figure out what they wanted to say and Jefferson crossing things out. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the document, but visually that gets across the humanness of the moment, and it gets us a little past the iconic way in which we think about the Declaration. So again, we're moving in a way from one document, common sense, to another, but part of what we're going to see today is that the Declaration of Independence was not an iconic document when written. And in fact, we're going to see how declaring independence was an event that reached far beyond the Second Continental Congress, an event that was hashed out in towns and cities throughout the colonies. As you're about to see, what we're talking about here is a wrenching process, a major decision that constituted an act of treason that colonists knew would set them on a dangerous path. It was a final break from a king that many were still clinging to. And it was a dangerous act that set a collection of colonies at war against the British Empire. So declaring independence was an important act, but we should be careful in assuming that the piece of paper that declared independence had some kind of magical, iconic value at the time it was created. It didn't. Actually, that builds decades later. You can see that in the 1790s and the early 19th century. Suddenly people are talking about who was the author of that piece. And look, he's our guy. And look what that says for our team. But initially, it's not that kind of an iconic document. It was not seen as the main focus of the process of declaring independence. It was almost seen as a formality. And it wasn't intended to state something dramatically new. As Jefferson said later in life, in what is now a pretty famous quotation about the Declaration of Independence, he said, quote, "Neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind." So as we're going to see in today's lecture, the Declaration was not filled with original thoughts born of the brain of Thomas Jefferson. It was not intended to be that kind of document. Rather, as he put it, it reflected American assumptions about government and the rights of its now citizens, not subjects, once independence is declared. So in essence, the Declaration of Independence transcribed a mass of ideas that had been brought into the open and then defined and shaped by what the colonists took to be British transgressions on their rights as British subjects. It essentially helped to create a new nation by exploring and explaining the colony's recent history and thereby justifying their really radical act. Even so, it was still no easy thing to decide upon independence, regardless of how logical it may seem to us. For one thing, big obvious question, what sort of future did independence hold? No one knew. Many colonists realized that declaring independence would bring with it a devastating war with a mighty imperial power that would bring with it death and destruction and, quite possibly, defeat. And on top of these really logical fears, even at this late point, still, many colonists are still envisioning themselves as fighting for British rights. Most colonists still had such a deep connection with the mother country that independence felt like an almost physical affliction. As John Dickinson of Pennsylvania wrote, and he was known to be a moderate colonist, he said, "The colonies are being torn from the body to which we are united by religion, liberty, laws, affections, relations, language, and commerce." Torn from the body, that really gets across the feeling that people felt about this. Now, that's a member of the elite, John Dickinson. At this point, I want to turn to something that often gets left behind when we discuss independence, but I think it's absolutely crucial. It's actually at the center of this story. So what I want to talk about now is what people generally in the colonies thought about independence. Because it wasn't only in the Continental Congress that independence was being discussed. And even there was an assumption that the Congress was acting on behalf of the larger populace. And in fact, many colonial delegations to the Continental Congress felt compelled to have direct orders from the people of their colony back home before they took the huge step of voting for independence. There's a wonderful book by a historian named Pauline Maier, a great scholar. She died a few years ago. She was kind of actually a mentor and model for me. She loved delving into documents, which, not surprisingly, I love doing. I always describe myself as an archive rat. I want to be in with the stuff. Pauline also had a wonderful sense of humor, which she allowed into her lectures. And in a sense, Pauline kind of gave me permission to have a sense of humor when I talk about history as well. Now, the book that she wrote about the Declaration of Independence, it's titled American Scripture, Making the Declaration of Independence. And it does an absolutely wonderful job of looking at what people throughout the colonies, and not just the Continental Congress, felt about independence. She also talks in great detail about what was going on in the Continental Congress. But she shows some things that I think are pretty extraordinary with some wonderful documents that she found. She explains in her book that while studying the activities going on in the colonies during the months of April and May and June and July of 1776, she discovered over 90 other declarations of independence. Local communities, counties, townships were meeting to debate independence, struggling with the idea of independence, trying to decide what they felt about it, and then declaring what they thought, and sending those documents to their delegates in the Continental Congress. And as Maier states in her book, these local declarations about independence allow us to get as close as we can to the voice of the colonial public on the eve of independence. Now, simply looking at the process of creating these local declarations reveals a vast amount of information about how the colonists at large were mobilized at this point, and how seriously many colonies took the idea that the people at large had to request independence, that the delegates in the Continental Congress were representing these people in just the way that the colonists felt Parliament was not representing the American people. So, for example, in Massachusetts, the Colonial Assembly asked individual towns throughout the colony to have town meetings to discuss this question, quote, "If the Honorable Continental Congress should decide that for the safety of the United Colonies it was necessary to declare them independent of Great Britain, would they solemnly engage with their lives and fortunes to support the Congress in that measure?" Now think about that. The Massachusetts Assembly is writing to towns and saying, you guys should be having meetings. You should get people together to discuss whether you actually believe in this and are willing to sacrifice for it. It's a real decision. It's not an ethereal idea. And there is an attempt here, and it happens, to create a conversation in which people can really discuss what it means and how they feel about it. So clearly, in some ways, independence was being treated as a kind of personal decision, and a highly significant one as well. Statements like the one that I just read from Massachusetts were asking colonists to discuss the issue and declare themselves willing to commit treason against the mother country. So it's a real decision by real people, in again, ways in which, speaking as someone who is always talking about, writing about, thinking about the founding, all of this immediacy tends to get erased in general when we think about it. And it's the immediacy and the humanity and the realness of it that captures the importance of it, the depth of it, how profound it was, and how hard it was. And it's easy to forget all of that. Now, discussion of independence went on for quite some time throughout Massachusetts towns, so people actually were seriously debating the issue. As a man from one town observed, quote, "Independence was the greatest and most important question that ever came before this town." I mean, think about that. I find that profoundly moving. There is someone from the time period saying, wow, this is a really big, important question, and here we are talking about it. We've never talked about a question this big and this immediate in this way before. That urgency and immediacy, and the fact that people are really, you can hear him struggling with and acknowledging what that moment meant. I find that profoundly moving, when you can get at the humanity of a seemingly iconic moment in that way. Now, in fact, by the time that many towns reported on independence to the Massachusetts Assembly, the Continental Congress had already decided in favor of independence. So for all of my talking about what Pauline Maier calls the other declarations, to some degree, they'd gotten some in the Continental Congress. Massachusetts towns were saying yay, but some of them hadn't quite made it there yet. But the people were part of the decision process. And if the first towns to report their thoughts had not supported independence, the Massachusetts delegates to Congress might have had a hard time promoting it in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In Maryland, too, there was widespread participation in the decision for independence. These other declarations of independence were possibly more important in Maryland because the Maryland congressional delegation was undecided about independence, and it wasn't until the Maryland legislature received declarations of independence from individual counties that it decided to instruct the delegates in the Continental Congress to support independence. Now, when I discuss colonial legislatures at this point in the build-up to war, it's important to realize that by this point in time, most of the royal colonial governments were wobbly and beginning to collapse. So the Continental Congress in May of 1776 instructed the colonies to begin to think about forming new governments. Right now we have to actually think about what's going to happen now that everything is sort of in a state of chaos. Think about forming new governments. And so most colonies ultimately were debating on what kind of a government they might want to have. And there was some variety, and I'll talk a little bit more about this next Tuesday when I talk about the Articles of Confederation. To some in the colonies, it was this resolution in May of 1776 asking the colonies to create new governments that constituted the real Declaration of Independence, even though it didn't declare independence officially. And it's significant that in the preface to this resolution, telling the colonies they should think about creating their own government, Congress attacked not the king's ministers or parliament, but the king himself. So this was as good as a formal declaration of revolution, even though it didn't quite get there yet. Now, meanwhile, throughout this period within the colonies, individual towns are debating independence. They're expressing their decisions in written statements that, as Pauline Maier notes, were remarkably alike in tone and content, listing the same grievances and the same sense of betrayal by their father, their symbolic father, King George III. Most of these other declarations mention the contempt with which the king had received their attempts at reconciliation. Most of these other declarations also adopted a really personal tone towards the king, blaming him personally for the present state of affairs and expressing great sadness and betrayal at the failing of what had once been their beloved monarch. Many of these declarations went even further, suggesting what kind of government they would prefer to stand in place of the monarchy. And in one way or another, many of these declarations specified that they wanted to establish a republican government, republican small r, a republic, throughout the colonies. They wanted governments grounded on popular will and actual representation. So what we're seeing here is relatively average people in towns throughout the colonies immersed in the current state of affairs, committing themselves personally to a course of action, expressing their ideas about what government should be, and personally taking part in the political process. In so many ways, the United States was created by average people taking action, thinking about what was going on, stepping forward, committing themselves, and taking action. Now, news of these other declarations of independence written in May, June, and July of 1776 helped push the Second Continental Congress toward independence. Meanwhile, back in Congress, on June 8th, debate on independence got underway. Those who were least enthusiastic about independence, men like John Dickinson and James Wilson of Pennsylvania and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, said that generally they were friendly to the idea, but the time was not yet right. Some colonial delegations were not ready to declare independence because they had no permission to do so from their home governments, and forcing the issue might push their colony to secede from what was already a rather weak colonial cooperative union. And of course, disunion among the colonies would have been disastrous for many reasons, among them that it would discourage foreign nations from offering aid in case there actually was a full-fledged war. So here's what Edward Rutledge of South Carolina wrote about the debate over independence on June 10th. The Congress sat till 7 o'clock this evening in consequence of a motion of Richard Henry Lee's rendering ourselves free and independent states. The sensible part of the House opposed the motion. They saw no wisdom in a declaration of independence nor any other purpose to be enforced by it, but placing ourselves in the power of those with whom we mean to treat, giving our enemy notice of our intentions before we had taken any steps to execute them, and thereby enabling them to counteract us in our intentions, and rendering ourselves ridiculous in the eyes of foreign powers by attempting to bring them into a union with us before we had united with each other. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, right? Edward Rutledge is like, yeah, no. In how many ways does this not make sense? On the other side of the spectrum, those who supported independence argued that without a formal declaration of independence, no nation would be willing to aid the colonies. This kind of lack of agreement and the importance of this decision led Congress to postpone the decision about independence until the first week of July to allow individual colonies to decide on a course of action. In the meantime, so no time would be lost, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to compose a written statement formally declaring independence. And the committee consisted of, not surprisingly, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. Local boy, Roger Sherman. The committee met, and they appointed Thomas Jefferson to draft their statement of independence. And he worked for the last 2 weeks. Every time I talk about independence and declaring it, there's some siren that goes by. The history gods are attacking. The committee met, they appointed Thomas Jefferson to draft their statement of independence, and he worked for the last 2 weeks of June in 1776. Now, in later years, when Adams and Jefferson were in their old age, as I have already mentioned, many, many people wrote to them wanting to hear the real story of declaring independence. And in 1822, Adams wrote a lengthy explanation of how Jefferson was chosen to write the Declaration. He wrote a letter. Someone said, "Tell us about it." And he says, "Okay, I'll tell you about it. Here you go." So he writes, "You inquire why so young a man as Mr. Jefferson was placed at the head of the committee for preparing a Declaration of Independence. I answer, Mr. Jefferson came into Congress in June of 1775 and brought with him a reputation for literature, science, and a happy talent of composition. Writings of his were handed about remarkable for their peculiar felicity of expression. Though a silent member in Congress, he was so prompt, frank, explicit, and decisive upon committees and in conversation, not even Samuel Adams was more so, that he soon seized upon my heart, and upon the occasion I gave him my vote and did all in my power to procure the votes of others." Now, John Adams then describes this process. He writes a script, like I said, he said, I said, he said, which I'm going to read you. But let me ask you, how many of you have seen the movie 1776? Okay, a good number. You know, 1776 was like the Hamilton musical of its time, right? Like when I was growing up, me and my brothers were seized by the musical 1776, which did something that at the time seemed ridiculous. It's a musical about writing the Declaration of Independence, right? And people were like, a musical about writing the Declaration of Independence? How can that make sense? And whenever we went on any kind of a car trip, I have the entire thing memorized, because whenever we went on any kind of a car trip, my brothers and I compelled my parents to play that soundtrack on 8-track tape, because that's how old I am. So we listened to it 892 times. I in my American Revolution course, I have a viewing of 1776, and not only do I know every word, and not only can I sing all the songs, I know where the 8-track clicks are. I really know 1776. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because what you're going to hear here, if you've seen the movie, is that some of what's in the movie is actually pretty closely taken to what Adams says about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So here's his little script. The subcommittee met, Adams writes. Jefferson proposed to me to make the draft. I said, I will not. You should do it, Jefferson insisted. Oh no, says Adams. Why will you not? Asked Jefferson. You ought to do it. I will not, says Adams. He has a real sense of drama here. Why will you not do it? Asked Jefferson. Reason enough. What can be your reasons? Asked Jefferson. Reason first. You're a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason number 2, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. I just love John Adams, right? And in the song, in the movie, he says, I am obnoxious and disliked. That cannot be denied. It's pretty close to reality here. He says, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Well, Jefferson responds, if you are decided, I will do it as well as I can. Obviously, Jefferson did draft the Declaration, which he then submitted to the rest of the committee for comment. Now, it's important to note the Declaration, as I mentioned before, wasn't intended to contain radically new ideas. It was intended, as Jefferson said, to reflect the American mind. And you can see that by looking at his sources. Pressed for time and trying to put colonial sentiment into words, Jefferson actually turned to whatever he could for fodder for his statement. Sometimes to Virginia documents, like his own draft Constitution for Virginia and the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which contributed to the Declaration's preamble. One of the passages that he culled from his Virginia writings included the charge that, quote, the king had waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the person of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Now, Jefferson here is trying to blame the king for slavery. The passage ultimately was cut by Congress, in part for very obvious reasons, because Southerners did not like an anti-slavery passage being in the Declaration. But the passage was also cut because it seemed to conflict with another passage in the draft declaration that attacked the king for offering enslaved people freedom if they fought for the British. My graduate advisor, Peter Onuf, whenever he talked about Jefferson, he was like the Thomas Jefferson expert. Talk about Jefferson, and Peter Onuf would say, deeply conflicted. And this is a great example of deeply conflicted. Even he himself in the document is conflicted. So he has one passage where he attacks the king for waging war against humanity by enslaving people, another passage in which he attacks the king for offering enslaved people freedom. Obviously, the passages were altogether unclear, as was the prevailing view towards slavery in Congress. And this would prove to be one of countless times in which the issue of slavery would be raised in Congress or in national debate generally, and then be pushed to the side as something that seemed to have no solution. In the end, the total effect of all of the individual charges against the king in the Declaration suggested that the king had displaced or unkinged himself. That he, and not the colonies, had brought events to where they were, and that he had created the need for colonial independence. You can really feel in the Declaration the emotion behind this final wrenching break of the colonies from the king. Now, it's important to note that as much as scholars and others have focused on the preamble of the Declaration, which would come to have vitally important significance over time concerning ideas and ideals about human equality, in fact, it was the specific charges against the king in the body of the Declaration that were considered to be the real meat of the document at the time. The preamble was intended to be just that, a preamble to the real meat of the document. Now, of course, the opening statement is particularly noteworthy, and I have to read it because how can I not read it? When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. One single sentence stating that the American cause was worthy of note in the course of human events and an appeal for authority to the laws of nature and nature's God, not the laws and statutes of Great Britain. Notably, the Declaration also described the colonies as one people, something that really had not been assumed at that time. So in that sense, the Declaration was kind of a wartime document, creating a united people, at least in word, to stand firm against their foe. The body of the document is a powerfully repetitive list of things the king had done that justified independence. He has. I encourage you, if you, and I'm guessing most people have not done this, if you have never read the grievances, the body of the Declaration out loud, do it. Because the power of that refrain, he's done this, he's done this, he's done this. There's a real power to that. So in essence, that list of things with the same sort of sentence structure shows that to the people signing that document, the king had proven himself to be a tyrant. And I'm going to list a few of the ways, a few of those grievances, what the colonies seized upon as evidence that the king was a tyrant. They said, he prevented the population of the American states by obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. He made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices. He kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. And I'm reading those directly from the Declaration. For all of those reasons and more, by the logic of the Declaration, King George III had proven himself a tyrant. And as the Declaration itself put it, quote, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Their meaning was clear. So the committee's draft was presented to Congress on June 28th. Debate and revision began on July 1st. Some of the changes had to do with specific word choices. So, for example, was the king really guilty of unremitting injuries? So the Congress preferred repeated injuries, which softened it a little bit. So there was a lot of word tweaking going on when they were revising the Declaration. Not all statements tamed the document. Sometimes Congress made charges more extreme, as when they added to Jefferson's statement something about sending foreign mercenaries, adding a phrase that described the act as, quote, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages. And as I just mentioned, Congress struck out the entire passage on slavery. Not surprisingly for many Southern delegates, this was a deal breaker. So as happens so often in this period and after, the issue of slavery and all of its implications about equality and humanity was just pushed aside. It would be future peoples, often marginalized people, who would take the claims stated in the Declaration and claim them as rightfully their own. They were in writing, they were in a founding document, there they were to be claimed. So in that sense, the Declaration of Independence became a tool, a ladder, to fight for rights in ways that the framers never really intended. Now, I can't resist one last anecdote about the Declaration, which I'm including because, again, it's a reminder that we're talking about a very human process of declaring independence, not a grand moment of founders, and also because I think that the students in this class will understand the feeling that I'm about to describe. And the story comes from Jefferson himself, who years later described how, as the Declaration was being edited by Congress, word by word, he was sitting in his seat, squirming, wincing at every little editorial change, and that in that process, Benjamin Franklin could see how uncomfortable he was, so he walked over to Jefferson, sat with him in the corner, and tried to calm him down. And I always say this to students. Imagine that you've handed a draft of a paper to your professor, and the professor has a red pen, and they're like, nope, bad, out. That's not going to be fun for anybody. And so Jefferson is kind of having a version of that experience. So Jefferson writes, Franklin perceived that I was not insensible to these mutilations. So he tries to distract Jefferson with a joke. And he tells the story of a hatter named John Thompson who wanted to open a shop and planned on creating a sign to hang over his door with the words, John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money, with an image of a hat. But first, Thompson decided he would ask some friends for advice. So one friend said, well, you don't need the word hatter. Obviously, someone who makes and sells hats for ready money is a hatter. Cut the word hatter. Another friend said, take out the word makes. People don't care who makes the hats. Another said, you don't have to include the phrase for ready money. Because, of course, customers are going to be paying money for hats. Yet another thought the word sells hats should be cut because obviously Thompson's not going to be giving away hats. In the end, the sign said only John Thompson with a picture of a hat. And the moral of the story, Benjamin Franklin told Jefferson, was to avoid whenever possible becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body. So on July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted to declare independence, and on July 4th, it formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. And then finally, on August 2nd, after all of the states, and now we've declared independence, they're states, on August 2nd, after all of the states had approved of the Declaration, it was formally signed. But once the Declaration had been adopted on July 4th, it needed to be publicized. And this took place in a variety of ways. And this gets back to my earlier idea about how declaring independence was an act. The Declaration was intended for an audience. It was a declaration of something. It was an act, not just a document. It was partly aimed at a foreign audience, but it was also aimed at Americans for mass consumption, and it was immediately sent to state assemblies and local committees of safety and American military figures to be read aloud, to announce independence to the American people and inspire them to fight for it. It was read out loud in public meetings and on the steps of Capitol buildings and in courthouses and in public squares. And in response, paintings of the king in public places were torn down and broken into pieces and burned in bonfires. In New York City, people pulled down a huge statue of the king mounted on his horse and supposedly melted it down to make musket balls. So the important point here is that the Declaration of Independence, like the Revolution, gave some Americans a sense of entitlement and engagement with American nationhood. Taken together, the Revolutionary War effort, Paine's common sense, and the public declaring of independence involved the American people in the ground level making of the nation. Now, of course, what I'm describing here does not include all of the American people by far. When the framers of the Declaration declared the American colonies one people, they were doing so in the realm of human events, in an ethereal kind of a space. They weren't wrestling with the far deeper meanings of their statement about a people's separate and equal station, or the ways in which the laws of nature applied only to white colonists. They created a document that was very much born of that moment, a king, his sins, and the need to justify independence, but that unleashed ideas and principles that would come to fruition down the road in ways that the framers of the Declaration never imagined, and many of them would not much have liked. In that sense, what does the Declaration of Independence show about America? Well, it shows a place of bold ideals that were largely at that moment unrooted in American realities. It shows how there's going to be an evolution of a struggle for rights that begins at this founding moment and that is going to continue all semester for the rest of this course. The evolution of American views about rights, which rights, and who has those rights. That very struggle about rights would take place in decades and even centuries to come. Thank you.